So welcome everyone. I'm president of the Lincoln Group of DC. My name is David J. Kent. And tonight's special program of the Lincoln Group of DC marks the 160th anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which was given November 19th in 1863. I'm going to kick off the program by reading the Gettysburg Address so that we all have it in our mind, and because it's very short. Then three of our members will each discuss one aspect of this brief but incredibly revealing elegy to our nation. First, Tom Peet will discuss how Lincoln viewed the Declaration of Independence and not the Constitution as the nation's key founding document. John O'Brien will discuss Lincoln's use of religious symbolism in the address. And then Ed Epstein will talk about how Lincoln's 2-minute speech at Gettysburg changed American political oratory forever. After that, all members will be invited to offer their own thoughts and questions to the discussion. I will be tonight's moderator. I'll ask that everybody use the little hand raise icon to begin this, but we will allow people to open up their microphones during that period. And please remember, obviously, always remain respectful. We'll begin with the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that their nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. Tom?
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Let me check. Can everybody hear me okay? Tonight, Ed Epstein, John O'Brien, and I are reflecting upon Lincoln's Gettysburg Address 160 years later, 272 words that revolutionized political speech. Our, and by that I mean America's, understanding of the Gettysburg Address and its meaning has evolved over time. Its brilliance was not widely recognized at first, receiving mixed reviews in the newspapers. Newspapers aligned with the Democratic Party panned it, and Republican newspapers praised it. The Times of London wrote, "The ceremony was rendered ludicrous by some of the sallies of that poor President Lincoln." The Chicago Times said, "The cheeks of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances." The Pennsylvania Harrisburg Patriot and Union opined, "We pass over the silly remarks of the president. For the credit of the nation, we are willing that the veil of oblivion shall be dropped over them and that they shall no more be repeated or thought of." On the other hand, the Providence, Rhode Island Journal said, "We know not where to look for a more admirable speech than the brief one which the president made at the close of Mr. Everett's oration. Could the most elaborate and splendid oration be more beautiful, more touching, more inspiring than those thrilling words of the president? They have, in our humble judgment, the charm and power of the very highest eloquence." The Springfield, Massachusetts Republican wrote, "Surprisingly fine as Mr. Everett's oration was in the Gettysburg consecration, the rhetorical honors of the occasion were won by President Lincoln. His little speech is a perfect gem, deep in feeling, compact in thought and expression, and tasteful and elegant in every word and comma." Edward Everett himself wrote on November 20th, the very next day, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." The truth is that almost no contemporary understood the importance that the Gettysburg Address would come to occupy not only in the American pantheon, but also among the world's great speeches. What was the basis of Lincoln's concise remarks? Lincoln himself said it best in Philadelphia in 1861. "I can say in return, sir, that all the political sentiments I entertain have been drawn, so far as I have been able to draw them, from the sentiments which originated and were given to the world from this hall in which we stand. I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." I believe that we can and should take Abraham Lincoln at his word. It is a fact that he mentioned the Declaration of Independence in his very first major public speech, the Lyceum Address in Springfield, Illinois, on January the 27th, 1838, when he was but 28 years old. As the patriots of '76 did to the support of the Declaration of Independence, let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor. The Gettysburg Address would be the last major public message in which Lincoln would directly refer to the Declaration. Lincoln clearly considered the Declaration, not the Constitution, to be the birth certificate of the United States of America. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 1863 minus 87 was, of course, 1776, which makes me think not only of the Declaration of Independence, but also of Saturday Night Live's Chevy Chase portraying Gerald Ford in the '76 presidential debate, saying, "It was my understanding that there would be no math." "No oppressed people will fight and endure as our fathers did," Lincoln wrote, "without the promise of something better than a mere change of masters." The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken which proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. Whether or not Lincoln liked or respected Thomas Jefferson, the man and politician, he didn't, if we are to believe William Herndon and Allen Guelzo. He revered Jefferson's timeless words. They were his lifelong touchstone. What some call Lincoln's first Gettysburg Address was 475 words, over 200 more than the Gettysburg Address itself. I will read a portion of it. Washington, D.C., July 7th, 1863. Fellow citizens, I am very glad indeed to see you tonight, and yet I will not say I thank you for this call, but I do most sincerely thank Almighty God for the occasion on which you have called. How long ago is it? 80-odd years? Since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation, by its representatives, assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. That was the birthday of the United States of America. And now, on this last 4th of July just passed, when we have a gigantic rebellion, at the bottom of which is an effort to overthrow the principle that all men are created equal, we have the surrender of a most powerful position in an army on that very day. And not only so, but in a succession of battles in Pennsylvania near to us, through 3 days, so rapidly fought that they might be called one great battle on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of the month of July. And on the 4th, the cohorts of those who opposed the declaration that all men are created equal turned tail and ran. Gentlemen, this is a glorious theme and the occasion for a speech, but I am not prepared to make one worthy of the occasion. In the previous passages, Lincoln referred to all men are created equal in 5 different ways. His logical mind, Dr. David Kent would say scientific mind, turning that phrase inside out, upside down, forwards and backwards to make sense of it and communicate his insights to his fellow countrymen and women. It was a self-evident truth, so obvious and accepted that it required no proof. A principle, a fundamental truth that serves as the foundation for a system or belief or behavior. A declaration, a formal or explicit statement which may or may not be true. A proposition, a statement or assertion that expresses a judgment or opinion. And logic, something that has to be proved. A sentiment, a view or attitude towards a situation or event. In the minds of Southerners, all men are created equal had become all white men are created equal, and the original a self-evident lie. Not so, said Lincoln. The world's most famous statement of equality was not and never had been a mere rhetorical tactic in his mind. At Gettysburg, Lincoln settled upon proposition, an objective yet to be achieved or an assertion to be proven. The nation had fallen short of his promise to be the last best hope of the world. This was the conundrum. Reverence for the Constitution, which Lincoln promoted as the basis for his political religion in his Springfield Lyceum address, not only protected and preserved the apple of gold, that all men are created equal, it also shielded its anathema, slavery. Because of this protection, William Lloyd Garrison believed the Constitution was a pro-slavery document and publicly burned it because it contained the 3/5 compromise, the prohibition against ending international slave trade for 20 years, the clause giving Congress power to suppress insurrections, i.e. slave uprisings, and the fugitive slave clause. Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, argued that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document because, among other things, the word slave and slavery could nowhere be found in it. Furthermore, the Constitution's language is we the people, not we the white people, not even we the citizens, not we the privileged class, not we the high, not we the low, but we the people, not we the horses, sheep, and swine, and wheelbarrows, but we the people, we the human inhabitants. And if Negroes are people, they are included in the benefits for which the Constitution of America was ordained and established. Lincoln sided with Douglass. Neither the word slave nor slavery is to be found in the Constitution, nor the word property even, and any connection with language alluding to the things slave or slavery, and that whatever in that instrument the slave is alluded to, he is called a person, and wherever his master's legal right in relation to him is alluded to, it is spoken of as service or labor which may be due, as a debt payable in service or labor. Also, it would be open to show, by contemporaneous history, that this mode of alluding to slaves and slavery, instead of speaking of them, was employed on purpose to exclude from the Constitution the idea that there could be property in man. However, Lincoln acknowledged both as candidate and president that he could do nothing about slavery where it existed because of constitutional protection. He insisted, though, that Congress had the power to bar slavery from the national territories, just as it had done when it affirmed the Northwest Ordinance in 1789. Lincoln never wavered from this position in spite of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. Hold firm as with a chain of steel, he advised one congressman. The Civil War changed all that and made possible the Emancipation Proclamation. Southern states, by seceding, had ceded the protection of the Constitution they no longer swore allegiance to. Daniel Crofts in Lincoln and the Politics of Slavery says, secession was the most calamitous example of bad judgment in all of American history. Like the Constitution, Lincoln did not specifically mention slavery, or Union, or rebellion, or North, or South for that matter in his Gettysburg Address. He didn't need to mention slavery, for slavery was the elephant in the room where it happened. Lincoln was unwilling even to suggest the possibility that there could be property in man at Gettysburg. It would be almost a year and a half before he would say publicly in the second inaugural address, 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was, somehow, the cause of war. Lincoln did not refer to slaves or slavery in the Gettysburg Address because many, almost certainly a majority, of whites in the North were yet unwilling to fight a costly civil war to free slaves, as Lincoln had noted in his letter to James C. Conkling in late August of 1863. You say you will not fight to free Negroes. Some of them seem willing to fight for you, but no matter. Fight you then exclusively to save the Union. I issued the proclamation on purpose to aid you in saving the Union. To Horace Greeley in 1862, Lincoln had written, I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Lincoln's personal wishes had not changed at Gettysburg in 1863. But 1863 was not yet 1865 when the 13th Amendment would be passed and become the King's Cure. Nevertheless, to whom, if not slaves, was this new birth of freedom going to apply? When was the nation finally going to live up to its proposition? And I'm going to paraphrase just slightly here, as I used to for my students, that all mankind is created equal. This question remains just as relevant in 2023 as it was in 1863.
Some historians have likened Lincoln's performance at Gettysburg to the Old Testament prophets. The manner of his presentation, the sacred vocabulary and imagery, and the tone of his remarks created for history a profound prophetic event. Lincoln had long been preparing for this. From his earliest public remarks, he often drew from examples and language of the most widely read book in America, the King James Bible. Lincoln began using biblical metaphors with his Lyceum address in 1838. Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust, he wrote. Let us re-purify it. Let us wash it white in the spirit, if not in the blood of the revolution. He concluded by linking his civil religion with a biblical declaration that if we let respect for the laws become the political religion of our nation, then the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, quoting Matthew chapter 16. In his 1854 speech denouncing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln declared of his country, let us keep it forever worthy of saving so that millions of free people around the world will rise up and call us blessed to the latest generation, quoting Luke chapter 1. In an 1855 letter to his friend Joshua Speed, Lincoln declared that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was conceived in violence. At both Kalamazoo and Peoria, he spoke of success in defeating that act in the language of salvation. Of course, his most prominent use of biblical allegories to that time was in his House Divided speech in 1858. In November 1863, just as he received the invitation to speak at the dedication, Lincoln got a strongly worded telegram from Illinois Governor Richard Yates, demanding that Lincoln act even more forcefully on emancipation. Yates did acknowledge that the president could not act faster than God and Providence permitted. Lincoln responded quickly, writing, Dick, Hold still and see the salvation of God, quoting Moses in Exodus. Lincoln did not quote directly from the Bible in the Gettysburg Address, yet he used language that evoked the sacred and spiritual imperatives of Scripture. The address is made compact and compelling by how it drew its verbal energy from biblical vocabulary and concepts. The Gospels were mustered into the service of the Declaration of Independence as the instrument of national rebirth. From the opening phrase, Lincoln put his audience in a biblical frame of mind. Lincoln drew from the King James Version's archaic words and cadences as he opened with the Old Testament sounding 4:7, an echo of the 90th Psalm's 10 years allocated to the man on this earth. The 4 clause is prologue for our fathers, a phrase evocative of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6, perhaps the most recited prayer in all of Christendom. The rest of the address is an elaborate metaphor that referred to creation, conception, birth, and baptism. Brought forth alludes to the biblical usage from Genesis that means begat or sired, the female role of bearing new life, and, in nature, the visible appearance of fruit. In Micah chapter 4, bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. Thou shalt go forth out of the city, and the Lord shall redeem thee from the hand of thine enemies. In Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. Conceived as part of the birth process and of creative imagination. Lincoln thus subtly linked the birth of the United States of America with the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. He continued with brought forth, the words in the Gospel of Luke that describe Mary's delivery of Jesus, the first instance of what turns out to be a repeated image of conception, life, and new birth, culminating in the promise of eternal life in the words, shall not perish. A startling echo of Jesus' words to Nicodemus in John 3:16, whosoever believeth shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Brought forth also calls to mind a theme of liberation, equating the emancipation of enslaved blacks in America with the deliverance of the children of Israel from Egyptian bondage in Exodus and Deuteronomy. This surely resonated with a nation in the midst of a war fought because of slavery. The unifying theme of the address, woven throughout from beginning to end, is the conception, birth, death, and new birth of the nation. Our fathers brought forth a new nation conceived in liberty, Lincoln began. For Lincoln, the new nation was not conceived in sin or pain, but in liberty. Liberty, or the love of liberty, was the central passion that produced the nation. While liberty is linked backwards to the nation's conception, equality is more prospective. It involves dedication. At the moment of christening or baptism, the infant nation is placed on a certain path. That is dedicated to a purpose, which Lincoln now defined as freedom and equality. All this must be done in obedience to the divine will, under God. God supervising the new birth of freedom, the nation having been reborn and rededicated. The act of divine creation has made all men equal. This is not a new concept for Lincoln. If he did not subscribe to a specific church denomination or doctrine, his speeches, letters, and proclamations conveyed awareness of a politically active, justice-seeking, providential world order. Though the sacrificial shed blood of this great Civil War, Lincoln said, this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. A new birth evokes the gospel's central theme of regeneration and the hope of eternal life through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This theme took on powerful significance on a blood-soaked battlefield. In the shed blood and death of the Civil War, the old Union, corrupted by slavery, had died, giving hope for new birth and new life for the Union. Through this theme, Lincoln infused the war and the great sacrifice of the dead and wounded with meaning. Like Julia Ward Howe in the Battle Hymn of the Republic, he went on to link the atoning sacrificial shed blood and death of the brave men on Gettysburg's battlefield with the atoning sacrificial shed blood and death of Jesus Christ on the cross. This made a new birth and new life for fallen mankind. The soldiers memorialized in Lincoln's oration, like Jesus Christ, gave their lives so others might live. The nation, Lincoln pointedly observed in the opening clause, was born on July 4th, 1776. It was reborn in Gettysburg 87 years later, having descended into hell for 3 days of battle. Lincoln's text is liberally seasoned with other biblical idioms, such as resting place, might live, in vain, and from the earth. With altogether fitting and proper, this inclusive phrase also has the biblical implication from the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether in Revelation 19. Consecrate evokes the holy sacraments and dedication to faith. The work of consecrating the cemetery was already done by the honored dead. Lincoln repurposes his audience's duty that day to consecrate and hallow themselves to a new, higher purpose. Lincoln ends with a call to action, redirecting the thoughts and energies of his audience. We must rather dedicate ourselves to the unfinished work. Lincoln's use of the sternly grand language of the King James Bible has been described as a way of giving American English a reach and resonance it would otherwise not have had. The Gettysburg Address in its form and structure is a Jeremiad, or political sermon, so named for the dire warnings of the biblical prophets Jeremiah, Isaiah, and others. The Jeremiad has been described as a distinct American literary form. It's a fusion of sacred and secular forebodings. It's created by New England Puritan ministers who thought of their role as being both spiritual and practical guides. The purpose of the Jeremiad was to direct an imperiled people to the fulfillment of their destiny, to guide them individually toward salvation and collectively toward the American city of God. In the words of the biblical prophet Isaiah, "How long, O Lord, or when will our mission be fulfilled?" The Puritan Jeremiads invariably joined lament and dedication in reaffirming America's purpose. The object was to promote social cohesion around a mission. It asked the question, what is required for us to achieve salvation? At Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered his Jeremiad in the traditional 3 parts. He described the original errand of the founders and the foundation of his own political faith. He described the current danger to the mission. And finally, he charged his listeners with their individual duty to preserve and perfect the founders' vision. Lincoln had been exposed to this style and its positive effect when he attended frontier prayer meetings and other impassioned church preachers. He seems to have learned from their example some important lessons about using words for emotional effect. The preachers at revival meetings often took on the role of prophets, warning of God's unforgiving wrath and the implicit threat that we would perish if not successful. The dedication of a cemetery is a sacred event. The burial ground is actually blessed or consecrated to receive human remains. Lincoln's prophetic tone at Gettysburg was very appropriate. The chaplain of the House of Representatives, Reverend Thomas Stockton, captured this when he opened the ceremony with a short sermon. He finished by reciting the Lord's Prayer. As he intoned, "Our Father, who art in heaven," the entire crowd spontaneously joined in. Lincoln simply reestablished this reverent mood after Everett's oration. Lincoln offered a new definition of old truths, a new perspective on old traditions that unlocked deep American emotions, the mystic chords of memory that Lincoln referred to in his first inaugural address. Author Gary Wills has shown Lincoln achieved a revolution at Gettysburg by putting the central element of the Declaration of Independence, equality, in a new light as a fundamental principle of the Constitution, which does not mention equality at all. With the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln was preaching his own Great Awakening sermon. Lincoln's political religion, the source of his fervent spirituality, was founded not on a single-minded devotion to the cause of the Union, but rather on a matrix of interrelated propositions that became the objects of his pure faith: union, liberty, democracy, and equality. The Gettysburg Address was Lincoln's supreme expression of that faith, and he used his carefully chosen words to inspire an awakening throughout the nation, a rebirth of old ideas, a plea for his fellow Americans to change their own hearts. This was just as the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament calls upon the faithful to make you a new heart and a new spirit. There was, Lincoln said at Gettysburg, unfinished work and the great task remaining before the American people. In August 1862, Lincoln had written a note to himself in which he accepted that he was God's instrument for ending slavery. In his meditation on divine will, Lincoln accepted God's mission and gave himself permission to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. In his message to Congress later that year, he reminded the representatives of their responsibility to God to support emancipation. Now, in an appropriate spiritual setting, Lincoln declared that every American was God's instrument in furthering the political faith of the Founding Fathers. The message was for the country to support the Union and emancipation as the foundation of the new birth of freedom. The Gettysburg Address recognized the battle itself as a ritual of purification during which the old Union had died. In terms that resonated with patriots and evangelical Christians, Lincoln proclaimed a new birth of freedom, a spiritual rebirth of a new Union that would fulfill the promise of liberty for all. Now, in preparing this analysis, I relied on the work of several authors, Diana Schaub, Gary Wills, Gabor Borat, Glenn LaFantasy, Ron White, and Richard Carradine. And now I turn it over to Ed Epstein.
Thank you, John and Tom, for excellent presentations. 80 years ago, the crowd gathered at the New Gettysburg National Cemetery for its dedication on November 19th, 1863, heard these words at the start of the day's main oration. Standing beneath the serene sky, overlooking these broad fields now reposing from the labors of the waning year, the almighty Alleghanies dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet, it is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice to break the eloquent silence of God and nature. But the duty to which you have called me must be performed. Grant me, I pray you, your indulgence and your sympathy. The speaker of those words, longtime politician and orator Edward Everett, was what the cultural historian Jacques Barzun called, quote, a dealer in literary plush. He spoke at length, more than 2 hours that day, in a speech full of flowery rhetoric, classical references, and in a style way over the head of most of his listeners. Not long after he spoke, the President of the United States was introduced and spoke for about 2 minutes. When he was finished, Everett's style of speaking, which had long dominated American political speech-making, was consigned to the past. Historian Gary Wills, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Lincoln at Gettysburg, wrote, quote, it is no great exaggeration to say that all modern political prose descends from the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln's speech marked the triumph of deceptive simplicity and the democratization of American political rhetoric. Now, simplicity is actually very hard if it takes lots of work, if that simplicity conceals deeper meanings, as Lincoln's address did. Wills again. The spare quality of Lincoln's prose did not come naturally, but was worked at. The old myth was that Lincoln dashed off the speech on the train on his way to Gettysburg. We now know that this was not at all true. He toiled over it in his unique way, taking bits and pieces, scraps of paper, thoughts in his head that he kept, and he wrote the speech entirely himself. He didn't have any speechwriters. You have to look at the speech to see how deceptive the simplicity is. Wills again. It would be wrong to think that Lincoln moved towards the plain style of the address just by writing shorter, simpler sentences. After all, the last sentence of the speech is 83 words long, and any editor would cut that up into pieces. Lincoln was a masterful, self-taught stylist. He used flexible structure, rhythmic pacing, varied length of sentences. Like all revolutionary moments, the Gettysburg Address didn't mean that the old ways were swept away. Rather, they persisted. Now, on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson, a political science professor, president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, considered a great orator in his time, appeared before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. This came after years in which Germany had provoked the United States and Wilson, who was very reluctant to get into the European war. But finally, he felt he had no choice. This is how Wilson opened his speech, asking for war before a joint session. I've called the Congress into extraordinary session because there are serious, very serious choices of policy to be made, and made immediately, which it was neither right nor constitutionally permissible that I should assume the responsibility of making. Wilson went on in this vein for well over an hour, hour and a half, 3,400 word speech, in which he, as we say in journalism, he buried the lead, he buried his best parts. His most famous phrase from that speech is, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Now, simplicity in such a vein is something that occurs to some writers and orators various times in their lives. It doesn't come naturally to them. An example was Count Leo Tolstoy, who lived from 1828 to 1910. A recent article in the New York Review of Books talks about how Tolstoy, late in life, came to kind of regret that he had written these ponderous epics like War and Peace, Anna Karenina, these doorstop novels. This is a quote. Particular incident led Tolstoy to try his hand at broadly accessible art, very different from his earlier works. Speaking with a famous astronomer who had lectured on the spectrum analysis of the Milky Way, Tolstoy, realizing that most of the audience did not even know why day follows night, suggested that the astronomer lecture on elementary topics. This is now Tolstoy writing. The wise astronomer smiled as he answered, "Yes, it would be a good thing, but it would be very difficult. To lecture on the spectral analysis of the Milky Way is far easier. To be accessible, to be writing that what people can understand from you is hard work." And I give you an example from popular culture. The famous American songwriter Irving Berlin was known for his simple songs, which of course become American standards like White Christmas, God Bless America. Very simple lyrics, but they hid a lot of hidden meaning for people, which is why they have endured so well. Frank Sinatra was often asked what was his favorite song, and he gave various answers over the long years of his career. But one song he mentioned frequently was Irving Berlin's Always, which is still played at a lot of weddings. And here's the opening of that to show how simplicity can be hokey, but also harbor deep feeling. I'll be loving you always, with a love that's true always. When the things you plan need a helping hand, I will understand always. Now, Berlin was known as a very prolific songwriter. He lived to be past 100 years old. I think he was 101 when he died. But he struggled to make things look simple. It was not easy for him, though he churned out thousands of songs. The story is told that, Berlin was partners with a producer, Sam Harris. They built the Music Box Theater on Broadway together, still there. And this is where they staged Berlin's musical shows, his musical reviews, Words and Music by Irving Berlin. One of their shows, Irving Berlin had written all but one song they still needed. And the cast and crew and the orchestra was at the Music Box Theater with Sam Harris. They're rehearsing, and they're waiting for Berlin to turn in the final song. And Berlin, not to be seen, it doesn't show up. Just unlike Irving, he's usually very fast for Sam Harris. So Sam Harris took a taxi over to Berlin's home where he had his little studio set up. And he said, Irving, what's wrong? We're waiting for you at the theater. Everyone is waiting. It's costing us money. And Berlin says, Sam, I'm having a terrible time with this song. I'm really struggling with it. He says, well, what's the problem? He says, it's not simple enough yet. Just not simple enough yet. Lincoln's speech making evolved over the years. Why? Lincoln was a man of his times. He loved new technology. He loved the telegraph. He loved the newspapers. He always read newspapers. He loved the new railroads, and he also was a man who saw the country changing rapidly around him. The 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s were the period of the most rapid immigration in American history, growing by 20, 25% a year, population. So he took all this into account. He saw the world changing. He saw that the old way of speaking could not last. This is a quote from historian Andrew Del Banco in a book of essays called Our Lincoln. Quote, extension of the franchise was hastening the decline of what the historian David Hackett Fisher has called the culture of deference, a political culture, that is, in which public speech had been mainly an insider discourse belonging to people of learning and high social status, to whom the broader public was expected to listen in a spirit of deferential consent. Now, Lincoln's words at Gettysburg lived on in American political thought and in the consciousness of politicians. I take you now to December 7th, 1941. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor that day. President Roosevelt was at the White House, meeting with cabinet, with generals, admirals, receiving messages from Hawaii and then from the Philippines as they were attacked. That evening, he called in his secretary, Missy LeHand, and dictated a speech about 700 words, would run for 6 minutes and 30 seconds. He didn't use any of he had speech writers, but he didn't use them for this particular little speech. And during the course of the day, Secretary of State Cordell Hull showed up at the White House. Hull, like Roosevelt, was an acolyte of Wilson during the First World War. And Hull had been involved in protracted, fruitless negotiations with the Japanese throughout 1941 to try to head off conflict. And he'd been keeping notes, he'd been making memorandum to himself, figuring that if a confrontation came, there was make a speech for Congress, a la Wilson in 1917. So he showed up at the White House with this speech, an hour and a half long, setting forth the history of these negotiations, the long history of grievances with Japan, why we were right, Japan was wrong. Roosevelt never liked to tell people no. He always made them feel that he went along with them, and then when they left, he'd poo-poo them. But he said to Cordell, well, I'll look at it and see. As soon as he left, he threw it aside. I think Hull tried later again that day to get him to take his speech. But of course, we know that the president delivered his own famous speech. Now, to me, the reason I'm going on about this is if you listen to FDR's opening paragraphs here, I see strong echoes of the Gettysburg Address in the rhythm, in the tone, in the use of simple words and structure, very reminiscent of the Gettysburg Address. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. And then his peroration at the end, like Lincoln's last sentence, no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Lincoln gave us a new way of communicating. a way that is still evolving today. It was democratic, small d, in that everyone could understand, everyone was being spoken to. It was accessible, people understood. Probably the most difficult word he used in the Gettysburg Address was consecrate, just as FDR used infamy, which probably sent people across the country rushing to get their dictionaries. What does infamy mean? Sounds like a disease. And it was accessible, and it gave the orator a chance to be inspiring, to inspire his audience. But remember that it's very difficult to write such deep simplicity. And leave it to Mark Twain to say it best. I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And I want everybody to take a minute just to thank Tom Peet and John O'Brien and Ed Epstein for their contributions to this and laying out the different aspects of the speech. And as you saw, it's a very short speech, 272 words, took 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, but it's packed full of information and ramifications, which all of the speakers talked about. I will open up now, and basically what we're going to do, we'll start off at least with people can raise their hand using this reactions mechanism so I can see it. We'll start with that, and then if it evolves into a more open discussion, that's good. I will ask that if you have a question, try to direct it to one of the three speakers for their whatever was relevant to what they were saying. And if you have a comment or a further observation, then obviously it could be open to anybody else. So we'll start with Scott Schrader, who has had his hand up. Go ahead, Scott. So open up your mic, and then after you're finished talking, close your mic again. So.
Thank you guys very much for your presentation. I think it was fantastic. I've presented on this topic several times myself, and I know how hard it is, even in the time you have, to whittle down all the thoughts you have on this particular speech. I have several comments and questions. I'm going to start just with one and let people kind of circle back through, and I'll come around to the other. This one is directed, Tom. When you had your some of the positive and critical responses to Lincoln's speech in the newspapers, I used several of the same ones you did. And a comment I wanted to bring up, I found it in my notes here, for the Harrisburg Patriot Union gave their critical appraisal of Lincoln's speech. But it should be noted that on November 14th of 2013, after 150 years of reflection,
they apologized. Yeah.
Yes, the Harrisburg Patriot News, which is the offspring newspaper, retracted their critical appraisal of Lincoln's speech, and they said, quote, in the editorial about President Abraham Lincoln's speech delivered November 19th, 1863 in Gettysburg, the Patriot and Union failed to recognize its momentous importance, timeless eloquence, and lasting significance. The Patriot News regrets the error. I'll move on and let somebody else make their comments and questions.
Okay, Russ, you had a question in the chat. Do you want me to just read it, or do you want to open your mic and ask it?
You can read it.
Okay, so Russ Wood is saying, can you parse, to John O'Brien, can you parse, it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this?
Parse it. The biblical reference on that would have come from the cohesiveness, the togetherness that Lincoln would have pulled from the phrase that he eventually used in the second inaugural. That is all together, the judgments of the Lord are altogether fitting and proper. Lincoln used the two words in the Gettysburg Address all together, but the context could also be played out as pulling this this higher level of biblical awareness into the content of the Gettysburg Address. So I think this he consciously is pulling this very inclusive term to tie it in with the Almighty.
John, before we go on, do you think the people that were in the audience that day understood these biblical references that Lincoln was making? Because they're fairly subtle that today I'm not sure everybody would catch them.
Well, some are very obvious, but for most of the speech, I think what I tried to describe is what people who had been raised in the Bible tradition would have had an emotional reaction to the language. And I think that was what Lincoln was driving for, more than say, oh, that's that part of the Bible. He was trying to get the evangelical Christian reflex that 80% of the country had some exposure to at the time. So I think he was playing on that subtlety rather than having them try to think, what passage is that? He was more concerned with getting an emotional response based on their religious background.
Mhm.
Okay. John Willen, you had a question?
Well, a comment and a question. First of all, I just wanted to comment on how great the three presentations were and how lucky we are in this group to have this kind of resources and people to make presentations like that. It was really good, really fantastic. And for Ed, I too I like FDR's speech, or Day of Infamy speech, has always reminded me of Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. And in your research, how much influence do you think that FDR, how influenced was he by Lincoln?
Well, it's hard to answer that question because if Lincoln didn't leave behind any, memoirs or a diary, FDR certainly didn't. He was one of the most secretive, unreflective presidents that we had. But I think it's pretty clear that, as you and I both noticed that it does draw upon the Gettysburg Address. And of course, FDR could have just turned to his speechwriters. He had some of the best of all time. He had Robert Sherwood, the playwright, and Sam Rosenman, who worked on many of his other speeches. But this time, he decided to do it on his own. So we just don't know what FDR was thinking. We do know that he wanted a short, direct speech. He told Hull, we know what he told Hull from Hull's recollection was that the American people are furious after this attack yesterday, and they don't need a long they don't need a long history about our conflict with Japan. It won't make any difference.
It certainly reinforces the point that everybody's trying to make here, that because if he would have given the speech that Hull wanted to, nobody would have remembered. And anybody who knows history knows about FDR's Day of Infamy, which
right.
was infamy.
Mm-hmm. That is correct.
Hey, Nancy Spanhouse.
Thank you. I really appreciated particularly the lengthy presentation by Mr. Peet. The Lyceum speech is one of my favorites, and I've taught a couple classes where it's really been an eye-opener for people in lifetime learning to understand how Lincoln thought about our political institutions. I mean, I would make sure that I don't think you meant it to see the Constitution in contrast as a conflict with the Declaration, which some historians do. Lincoln obviously was totally dedicated to preserving the Constitution, as I believe correctly, as you indicated, a protection of what the rights that were established in the Declaration. If it's okay, I'd like to read my favorite part of Lincoln on the Declaration. It's only 2 paragraphs. It's in a book that I'm writing about to finish. I've written on Hamilton, on Hamilton, the essentialness of a Hamilton program to stop slavery. But it means looking at the Declaration. It's from the last debate with Frederick Douglass in Alton. And you experts are probably all familiar with it, but I think a lot of Americans are not. I think the authors of that noble instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. They defined with tolerable distinctness in what they did consider all men created equal, equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This they said, and this they meant. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, or yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances would permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even, though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. I really think that Martin Luther King took from that on the promissory note. That's the concept, and it's a concept that's very important coming into the 250th, and Lincoln says it best.
I agree. Could I comment a bit on the ideological conflict that Lincoln had with his Constitution that was protecting the Declaration of Independence as all men are created equal? I don't believe that Lincoln at that time appreciated just how much the founding fathers had allowed the Constitution operationally to favor slaveholders. I think that he saw them more than was actually true at wanting slavery to be put on the course to ultimate extinction. Some of them certainly did, but I don't think as many as he hoped or believed. And he and Frederick Douglass both, that was one of the basis that they could then say the Constitution was an anti-slavery document for these reasons. But in a lot of respects, it was a pro-slavery document. And that's something I don't know how Lincoln grappled with in his lifetime. I think that caused some cognitive dissonance with him.
No,
Tom,
I disagree, but I don't think we have time to discuss that.
Well, let me ask a question, not so much disagree, but ask a question to Tom. Politicians in general, but people in general, and Lincoln specifically in this case, he is dealing with the current reality. And when you deal with current reality, it gets a little fuzzy sometimes, I think, what they believe about something like the Constitution versus what they are trying to project into society to convince people of the forward movement. So it doesn't, even if he says, it's anti-slavery, it doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't recognize the pro-slavery parts, and even the anti and pro part are debatable, terminology. But he doesn't necessarily mean he misses that or he disagrees with that, but that he's trying to push a direction forward, which it's convenient to have the Constitution being an anti-slavery document. And I think he did that. Frederick Douglass did that. Lloyd Garrison did the opposite. He said it was a pro-slavery document and burned it.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be careful as historians and as people interested to keep in mind that it's much more complex than simply
Right.
he said something and that's what he believes. It's more, you also have to consider he's saying something to try to move the public opinion.
And that would be true of Lincoln in almost every case.
Right. And I
He's
agree
far
with
more
you.
complex. He's far more complex than than we often give him credit for. And that came to me. I just finished a book that's 12, 13 years old, and I missed it somehow, but it's called my book is Reading Lincoln. This is Reading with Lincoln by Robert Bray.
Yes.
Lincoln was far, far better read and self-educated than I understood at the time. He was very complex in his reading and his political theories, and I did not appreciate that until very recently.
We may come back to that because I have a point about Robert Bray's book and what Lincoln read, but I want to hold off here and
I got to
jump
give
over.
a plug. That gives me an opening to promote our study forum. Now reviewing the book by Alan Guelza, which gets very deeply into the Lincoln's deep philosophical thinking on political economy and such. So thanks for that opening, Tom. Everybody's welcome to join the study forum that meets once a month on a Saturday morning. Look us up on the website. We'd be happy to have you.
Okay, I'm going to jump back and get Kelsey, who has been waiting patiently to to ask a question or offer a comment. Go ahead.
Thank you, David. I just want to make sure that Dan wasn't trying to jump in on that before I take us in a different direction. No, Dan, you didn't have a constitutional
well,
thought?
I did want to respond briefly to Tom's point. I was thinking that if Lincoln did have a cognitive dissonance about the Constitution and the Declaration, I think he resolved that in his own mind and for the public in his Cooper Union speech.
Yeah, which is what I quoted from, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he made a great case that the founders essentially were determined that slavery would be on the course of ultimate extinction, and I think in his own mind he was convinced of that, and he made a good case for it. So.
Oh, I think you're right that he was convinced of that. I'm 100% with you on that, Dan.
Well, and there again, there's a question. There's the Constitution, and then there's the founders who wrote the Constitution and other parts that Lincoln goes through and enumerates in order to get to the majority of founders believed that slavery should disappear and that they could put it on the path to ultimate extinction. So go back to Kelsey again.
They didn't anticipate the cotton gin.
I'm sorry, John, what?
They didn't anticipate the cotton gin.
Right, and that's something obviously that I've written about in my book, but the cotton gin kind of messed things up because it made slavery much more profitable and changed a lot of things. But it was no guarantee you were going to get rid of slavery anyway.
Well, they couldn't have ratified it, but if they tried to eliminate slavery, the guys like Pinckney in South Carolina and the other southern states wouldn't have gone along with it.
Right, there are always clear differences of opinion and interest in
if you
what
read,
to do about it.
We don't want to get too far off the subject, but if you read the books about what happened at the Constitutional Convention, never would have happened.
Kelsey, did you have a question?
I do indeed have a question.
Okay.
Also, first of all, I just want to commend everyone. This is fantastic. This is my first meeting, and I'm definitely going to be more involved. You all are fantastic. I'm very excited to be here. So I often stir the pot with this question, and it comes out a lot with this particular speech. But so I guess in response to like Ed and John in tandem, Lincoln was obviously a great communicator. He knew his audience, evangelicals, hitting on religion, and then he was also familiar with this new technology and shortening his sentences, making it very succinct, easy to understand. So do we think that he was religious deep down, or was he simply communicating adeptly with an audience, and he knew his audience and how to reach them. So I'd love both of your opinions and other opinions on this. I have my own opinion, but I like to hear from other people.
Lincoln was a very spiritual man. He was not a doctrinal religious person. He understood all the various creeds. I thought he probably studied and learned as much about the different faith creeds as anybody, but he didn't. There was something in every one of them that prevented him from stepping into a particular denomination. But he did retain this general spirituality, an appreciation of some divine being ruling the universe, and he continued to try to get in touch with that force. So spiritual, but not doctrinally Christian or religious.
But
he was a
John,
free thinker. He was a free thinker. I think he looked around at philosophy and science and anything he could think of, anything he could find that provoked thoughts in him, and used that to build his philosophy. But he also loved people. You know, he was very empathetic and compassionate and slow to anger, except with Mary.
John, he did attend the Presbyterian church both here and in Springfield, but you wouldn't call him a Presbyterian, though, right?
No, he never called himself a Presbyterian.
Yeah.
No, in fact, each of the denominations then had strict rules for joining.
Creeds that he didn't like.
He had to sign on to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and there was too much in there that he couldn't abide.
He just went to church. That's all.
Yeah, right.
Well, and that's where I get into. Yeah. Was it performative, and because he knew he needed to speak to an audience, and he really
was sincere, very sincere.
You think so?
This was part of him, yes. But he also appreciated that others believed this.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with you on that. I think that a deep,
very respectful of others, and then keeping his own counsel, but enjoying a broad spiritual view of the connection with the heaven and earth.
Yeah, which differentiated him from many people in that day.
But he also, as our December speaker will tell us about Lincoln, the Booths, and the spiritualists, he also went along with Mary's trying to reach the dead, trying to reach Willie and Eddie and other relatives. He went along with that. He paid these charlatan spiritualists.
He humored his wife.
Well, we'll hear more about that in December, but you know, he kind of played along to some extent because Mary was much more.
Lincoln was not a spiritual.
But to what Kelsey said, I just want to make one point. You mentioned performative, and maybe performative isn't quite the right word. It sounds like he was certainly aware of the Bible and the language and how the effect that would have, and that this was a way that he could reach people and communicate with people, in addition to his own levels of belief.
Yes, so, Kelsey, let me recommend a couple of books, Kelsey, that are worth reading. Both of them are not new. One's from the 1920s by William Barton called The Soul of Abraham Lincoln.
Yep.
And the other one is from the 1990s by Wayne C. Temple called From Skeptic to Prophet. Both of those are a pretty good assessment of why Lincoln was not a Christian, even though both authors really wanted him to be able to categorize him as a classical Christian, but they couldn't. And they were both honest about it.
Yeah. You could add in Ellen Gelzo's Redeemer President, which is what we're reading in the book group right now. And Richard Cowardine's, what was the name of Richard Cowardine's book, John?
Lincoln.
Lincoln.
Easy enough to remember. Yeah, Dr. Gelzo is someone who I've ruffled some feathers with on this very topic, but I feel like we're moving into a very interesting point in like the overall academic and scholarship on Lincoln, where a bunch of people my age, younger, haven't been raised in organized religion. So I feel like we might be getting into a whole different perspective on this, because at the end of the day, it's all perspective, right? We will never get to talk to the man. So I just feel like some authors are projecting things. So that's why I wanted some other insight on it. And I just find it very fascinating in this current.
Well, that's one of the problems, that Lincoln said very little about his own beliefs. And what we do have that he said is secondhand said, somebody else reporting what he said. So it's very difficult to know exactly.
In the same vein, I just got a new book. It's called Lincoln's God by Joshua Zeitz. It says how faith transformed the president and a nation.
Right.
So that might be something.
But the subtitle lies. It tells you a lot about the context of Lincoln's faith, which is an amazing discussion of the religious changes in society in the early 1800s to 1860, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot about what Lincoln himself thought.
Yeah, I would agree.
Was someone familiar with the quote that I saw at the Lincoln Memorial University that they have on the wall of Lincoln saying, sometimes, when I have to make a decision, the only thing I can do is get down on my knees and pray?
I'm not sure that's legit.
I don't recall the source, but I'm pretty sure I found something that said that wasn't. It's highly unlikely that he said that, but that's one of the problems. We don't know always what he actually said. So, Scott, you have your hand up. What? Go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment about, and this was kind of taking a couple steps backward here, but what Kelsey had said, and I agree with John about Lincoln's sincerity with that, because there are sources, and I can't remember if it was a letter he wrote or if, again, as David said, a secondhand thing. He enjoyed listening to the sermons. It wasn't just performative about him being there. He told people how much he enjoyed, and John can speak to the Reverend Phineas Gurley. That was one in particular. Yes. That he enjoyed going and listening to the sermons. How he absorbed that into his life, one could wonder, because he didn't tell us, but he did enjoy listening to the various reverends preach.
Of Gurley, he said, "I like Gurley. He don't preach politics."
John Swallow, do you have something you want to say? You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, John.
Yeah.
There you go.
At National Archives about 8-9 years ago, and I can't think of his name. I think his name was James Joseph something. Got a couple Pulitzer Prizes. Wrote a biography of Jefferson. He said at National Archives that in the first sentence, Lincoln actually lied, because at our founding we were a confederation of 13 nominally independent states, not one nation. And that kind of took me. I mean, because we were one nation after the Constitution was ratified, but not before. Now, and corollary to this, I mean, before the Civil War, the nation was referred to as these United States, plural. After the Civil War, because of the challenges of keeping the Union together, that led to the Civil War, the country is seen as the United States, one nation. What do you guys think of that? And I cannot remember his name. I can picture him.
Lying is not the right word.
Lying is not appropriate. It's a difference of view. It's I can still look back and say the United States began on July the 4th. Actually, it was July the 2nd, but July the 4th, 1776, and understand that the Confederation was very weak compared to the federal government that was created in 1787. It was still the United States.
It was the first strong statement of all the colonies that they had a united purpose.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Remember
Well,
that
and
2026 is the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation.
Mhm.
Not, it technically is July 4th, 1776, which is when we sort of signed when we say we signed the Declaration of Independence, but that's what we're talking about in 2026, and that's what we talked about on the 200th in 1976. So we consider it the founding of our nation. Now you could make that argument that the Articles of Confederation, which is what we started with, maybe that wasn't a nation, but you can
It
make
was
the
an
counter
eternal,
argument as well, and it's
it
more
was an eternal
complicated.
union, perpetual
Lincoln-
union, though.
Lincoln.
Yeah, that's right. That's
The
right.
Gettysburg
Perpetual union.
Address. The Gettysburg Address says 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth a new nation. That doesn't mean the nation was born fully formed. It was brought forth. It was the beginning of this. It was the
Yeah.
beginning
Yeah,
of the
okay.
project of building the nation. He didn't claim that the United States, as it was known in 1863, was born in 1776. It was an infant,
Right.
still being
Right. Yeah,
formed.
okay.
Well said, Ed.
He also said that unlike most historians, he because matrilineal DNA, he thought that Jefferson did not have the sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, and he said he thought it was Jefferson's 12-year younger ne'er-do-well brother.
Blah, blah, blah.
And later,
Not
recently,
true.
the last year or two, he's changed his mind because he got evidence that was irrefutable. So,
Okay, well,
but I mean,
let's bring in
so-
Dan Pritchard. You had a comment you wanted to make about this, right?
I was about to say earlier that I think the guy sounded like a neo-Confederate, and now I'm confirming that. But Lincoln would have argued that had the colonies not come together on July 2nd, July 4th, 1776, they would never have gotten their independence and freedom. So the Union, that was the key to the nation. The colonies coming together, and then they could get their freedom.
Right.
I think the insidiousness of this discussion, though, that what John was describing, is that there now is this movement, I guess there has been a movement, to clearly separate the Declaration from any connection with the Constitution. On a strict legal basis, they're just making the point that there is no connection. And if you believe that there is, that in fact the Declaration is the mission statement of the United States, you are a declarationist and are in favor of less than legal interpretations. So there is a strong movement out there continuing to push this, and it's disturbing.
Yeah, there'll always be a contrary view, and if you just start promoting all of the contrary minority views and making them legitimate when a lot of them aren't, it becomes very difficult to discuss with. And that's the big thing about being historians and people interested in history, is working your way and cutting through the chafe. There's a lot of noise back in history, especially the way it was written, and it's very difficult to really get to what really matters then and today.
Well, I don't know if you want to get too much into the weeds of the actual day, but since I talk about this at the Smithsonian a lot because we have Jefferson's desk that he wrote the Declaration on. So when I give the tours there and I talk about it, and I research this pretty well, and so is the museum.
Right.
John Adams himself said it was going to be July 2nd with illuminations and picnics. And he kept saying, you guys have the wrong day, actually, at the beginning. And he just gave up.
Well, let's try to bring this back to the Gettysburg Address.
Okay.
Russwood has a comment in the chat, which I'm going to read, and then we'll go back to Scott, and then we're going to run out of time. So we want to get
Pat
to
has
these
a
things.
question.
What would the context of the speech matter to its interpretation? So Gettysburg, people in attendance, where Lincoln stood, the flags, cemetery. What would all that context matter to its interpretation of the Gettysburg Address? Ed, maybe you.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Russ?
So there was that Lincoln gave the speech in a certain place, in a certain time, in a certain audience.
Yeah.
What effect would that have on how we interpret? Maybe it's interpreted then, but also
Well, my
well,
view of
how it should inform how we interpret it now.
my view of how he constructed the speech, there were two major things he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to take advantage of the emotion of the moment and this connection with the Almighty. These soldiers had died, and he wanted to make sure that the people who were there to consecrate this burial ground appreciated that the government sees this higher purpose as well. So he took advantage of the emotion by playing up the spiritual context of a burial, of a cemetery consecration. Secondly, he avoided naming the battle, naming anybody about the place except God. And by doing that, he kept this whole context open for interpretation over and over again in other settings, in future generations. So I think he had two things in mind. How do I make this not only relevant to the needs of today, but also make sure that this doesn't wear out in a short time, that it continues to be relevant in history.
He was trying to both recognize the day and what the people had sacrificed, but also point people towards the continuing process to save the Union. It wasn't over, but it was a big picture that still needed to be done.
So the context of the whole
the president
speech
was there.
supported his thought that he expressed. Yes.
Matt
Scott
Speak has a question.
Yeah, I want to go back to the language, the biblical prophetic language. When you Gettysburg Address in the second inaugural, it's almost like God speaking. And I wonder if his critics, both in the South and the Copperheads in the North, ever criticized him taking that role. I'm not talking about what he said, but it's a very prophetic, like people criticize Roosevelt for being a country squire, that kind of thing. Was any of the criticism of Lincoln based on his use of biblical, that he was putting on the robes of, my words, of a prophet?
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think so.
But
Okay.
I think they were a far more religious people at that time than we are now. And that's
No,
part
but
of the
that
context.
might have actually, I'm thinking that might have actually turned around the other way, where people who disagree with his policy said he's trying to take on a biblical role. That's what I was wondering. No.
I
Okay.
don't think they did.
I think the main dichotomy was the Republican supporting, pro-union supporting papers were very effusive about how great this was, and the Democratic, especially the anti-war Democrats and the South, of course, hated it and thought it was worthless and a horrible speech. So, yeah, the very partisan nature of all of that.
But they never went after the biblical style. That's what I'm saying.
I don't
Okay.
think so.
I didn't see anything.
Okay.
that
Well,
went
what
after
about the
biblical
London
style.
Times, though? They might have had that in mind.
The London Times?
I don't think they were complaining about him as a pseudo-religious leader, though. They just didn't like Lincoln, and they didn't like his speech.
Yeah. Scott, can you go ahead and ask yours, and then I think we need to wrap this up.
Well, this might be a good place to end then. As most people here know, there are 5 copies of the Gettysburg Address known to exist in Lincoln's hand, and there are several other newspaper accounts. So I was just curious, each of you guys, which version do you think is the definitive version of the Gettysburg Address, if there is one, and which ones did you guys look at when you were preparing your remarks?
I looked at all 5. I think the Nicolay version, where the first page was done in the executive mansion and the second page was done on foolscap. First page, Washington, second page, Gettysburg. I think that's the one he read from, and I think he extemporaneously added "under God" while delivering it. Other than that, we don't know exactly, because Lincoln didn't say that. I don't think any of the five were identical from one to the other.
Nicolay, that's interesting you said it. Nicolay said they are all identical in thought, but different slightly in expression. So you're right, they were all just a little different.
Mm.
Does anyone know if, as he was giving the speech at Gettysburg, that, I mean, some in the crowd thought it was fantastic?
There were several people that commented on that. Most people talk about they relate to whether there was applause or not to see how well it was received. I believe it was I can't remember if it was Daniel Skelly or perhaps William H. Tipton who was there, said, "Have you ever heard anyone applaud at a funeral oration?" Because that's what this was. It wasn't about being applause or received well. He gave dedicatory remarks. It was a funeral oration. So that person said there was not applause and there shouldn't have been, was his response. How the response just came later upon reflection.
Well, and when it was published nationwide, that's why it became really well known and famous. Because, I mean, everybody thought he was going to talk 20 minutes or something or more, and so there's no picture that we're liable of, other than we know he gave it.
I think we can say Edward Everett liked it a lot.
Everett.
Yes, okay.
Let me wrap this up, and if people want to stay after I shut off the recording, that's fine. But let me wrap this up by making a couple comments. First, there are a couple questions about where we can see this. We'll have this recording up as soon as we can, and C-SPAN will take it, and they will do whatever C-SPAN does to it and put it up on their site. And we will put that out, let people know when it's available. Also, there are video presentations out there of people reading the Gettysburg Address, including, I would point you to a year and a half ago at the Lincoln Memorial Centennial. We had Stephen Lang, the actor Stephen Lang from the Avatar movies, read the Gettysburg Address as part of our program. So if you look at the Lincoln Memorial Centennial, May 2022, you'll be able to find that piece, and you can watch the entire thing.
David, that's posted on our website.
That's posted on our website, so that's even easier.
That link is right on the cover page with the.
So that'll have the whole program.
The color guard.
I want to first, I'll make one comment and to thank and just give some kudos to Edward Everett. Edward Everett was the outstanding orator of the time. He had been president of Harvard University. He had been he had been Secretary of State or something. He had been in the other departments. He had been the vice presidential candidate in the Constitutional Union Party with Bell in 1860. He was extremely well regarded, and he was considered the utmost best orator in the country at the time, which is why he got to get the main speech at Gettysburg. Unfortunately for him, giving a good short speech is, handled better than by people than a good 2-hour speech, and things kind of changed after that. But Edward Everett did appreciate what Lincoln had done, as Tom mentioned, and actually got one of those copies. He asked, Lincoln to write him out a copy so they could sell it at the fairs to raise money for troops. So I do want to give some kudos to Edward Everett, even though everybody's pretty much forgotten him because of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. I also want to thank Tom Peet, John O'Brien, Ed Epstein for great presentations to get things started, and to thank everybody who was on this call. We had a very, very good turnout, and we had a lot of good questions, a lot of good feedback. We will do more of these types of programs in the future. So I will say thank you to all, and And we will continue with other programs in the future.